Mary was 68 years old, a retired primary school teacher who had spent most of her life nurturing young minds with patience and kindness. She lived alone in a little cottage on the edge of town where the scent of roses from her front garden always lingered in the air. Friends knew her for her gentle laugh and her endless collection of teacups, each with its own little story. But over the past year, something had shifted. Nights had grown long and restless for Mary. Sleep, once her faithful companion, now seemed to avoid her. She would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind running circles around old memories and little worries. It began quietly, almost too subtle to notice. First, it was just the occasional restless night. Then, entire weeks where sleep was broken into short, uneasy stretches. She started waking with a heaviness in her head, as though she had been carrying her thoughts all night instead of resting. Her days began to feel longer too. Without proper sleep, even her morning walks to the market felt heavier on her legs, and her smile came a little slower. Friends remarked on how tired she looked, and she brushed it off with a half laugh, saying, "I'm just getting older." But deep down, Mary worried something more was wrong. One evening, after another day of yawns and tea gone cold on the kitchen counter, she sat at her dining table with a letter from her doctor. The results of her recent checkup were mostly fine, but her doctor's note was gentle and clear. "We need to manage your stress and improve your sleep." It was the confirmation Mary hadn't wanted but knew she needed. It was not a dire illness, but it was the beginning of a decline if she ignored it. The thought unsettled her. She had watched too many of her friends slip into cycles of fatigue, anxiety, and poor health simply because they didn't take small warnings seriously. She promised herself she would not join them. That night, she sat by her kitchen window with the moonlight spilling across her table. She thought about her mother, who had lived into her 90s with a kind of calmness Mary had always admired. Her mother had her little evening ritual, a cup of tea brewed slowly, a moment of quiet, and a deep breath before bed. Mary could almost hear her mother's voice. "You have to tell your body it's time to rest, my dear." The thought made her smile faintly. Maybe it was time she gave herself permission to slow down. The very next morning, she wandered into the small herbal shop near the town square. It smelled of dried flowers, spices, and the faint earthiness of roots and leaves. On a low shelf, tucked between jars of peppermint and lavender, she noticed a small packet labeled chamomile flowers. The pale golden blossoms looked delicate, almost too fragile to hold any real power. But something about them drew her in. The shopkeeper, a kindly woman with silver hair pulled into a neat braid, noticed Mary's interest. "That's chamomile," she said warmly. "It's been helping people rest for thousands of years. My grandmother swore by it." Mary bought the packet without hesitation, as if it were a small gift to herself. That evening, she followed the shopkeeper's instructions. She placed a spoonful of the tiny flowers into her favorite porcelain cup, poured hot water over them, and let them steep under a little saucer to keep the warmth in. As she waited, the steam rose in gentle spirals, carrying a scent that was sweet, soft, and somehow comforting, like honey without the stickiness. She took her first sip slowly, the warmth filling her mouth and sliding down her throat like a quiet sigh. For the first time in weeks, she felt her shoulders loosen just a little. Over the next few nights, she made chamomile tea her bedtime companion. It wasn't a magic switch. She didn't fall into deep sleep instantly, but she noticed small changes. Her body seemed to understand the signal. It's time to slow down now. Her breaths became longer, her thoughts a little less tangled. On the fourth night, she slept through until morning without waking once, and when she opened her eyes to the pale morning light, she felt rested, almost lighthearted. It was such a simple thing, but it felt like a gift she had been missing for far too long. The change in her mood came quietly but noticeably. She began greeting her neighbors with more energy. She even found herself humming as she prepared breakfast. Her afternoon walks regained their rhythm, and she felt steadier on her feet. It was as though the gentle act of steeping chamomile flowers each night was more than just a drink. It was a message to herself that she deserved rest, care, and comfort. And somewhere deep inside, she sensed that the tea was working on her in ways she couldn't see. One Sunday afternoon, her friend Alice dropped by for tea. Alice had known Mary for decades and didn't hesitate to remark on her improved glow. "You look different," Alice said, squinting with curiosity. "Like someone who's just come back from a holiday." Mary laughed and reached for the chamomile packet. "This little flower," she said, holding it up, "has been my holiday." She told Alice about her restless nights, the doctor's warning, and how she stumbled upon chamomile. Alice listened, leaning forward as though Mary were revealing a secret treasure map. That conversation was when Mary realized her small bedtime ritual was more than just a way to help herself. It was a story worth sharing. She had seen how easy it was for people her age to accept sleeplessness, anxiety, and tiredness as an inevitable part of aging. She wanted them to know it didn't have to be. There was something profoundly encouraging about finding a simple, natural ally in a world that seemed to push pills and quick fixes. Mary's journey with chamomile was still unfolding, but already it had brought her back to herself. In the days that followed, she began reading more about chamomile. She discovered it wasn't just for sleep, it had been used for centuries to soothe anxiety, ease digestion, protect the liver, even help the body heal from within. Some of the stories she found were almost unbelievable, but they echoed what she was feeling in her own life. She realized her little evening cup was more powerful than she had ever imagined. And so Mary's story begins here, with one woman, a delicate flower, and the quiet but undeniable return of her well-being. It is a story about listening to the body's whispers before they become shouts, about finding healing in the simplest places, and about how a single, humble cup of tea can begin to change a life. The days after Mary's first week with chamomile tea felt almost like the early days of spring, quiet, gentle, and full of small but certain changes. The mornings were lighter somehow, even if the sun shone the same as before. She noticed she didn't reach for her coffee as quickly. Her hands didn't tremble when she buttered her toast. The heaviness behind her eyes, that constant reminder of restless nights, had softened. She wouldn't call it a miracle, not yet, but it was enough to make her curious. One afternoon, Mary decided to sit in her sunroom, the one with the wicker chair and the view of her garden. She opened the little tin she now kept on the table, its lid releasing that familiar, comforting scent. As she looked at the tiny flowers, she thought about how something so small could hold such quiet strength. She had spent her life teaching children about the wonders hidden in simple things, how a caterpillar could transform into a butterfly, how seeds could sleep in the soil until the right moment came. Perhaps this was no different. Perhaps chamomile was nature's way of teaching her a lesson in patience. Her neighbor, Thomas, happened to stroll by with his dog and noticed her at the window. He tapped on the glass and grinned. "Mary, you're glowing," he teased, though his tone carried a note of genuine observation. She laughed and waved him in, already reaching for the kettle. "I've discovered something," she said, almost in a conspiratorial whisper. "Something ordinary, yet not." Thomas raised an eyebrow as he sat down. "Go on." She poured him a cup, watching the steam curl up like threads of silk. "Chamomile tea," she said simply. He chuckled. "That's your big discovery?" Mary smiled knowingly. "You'll see." He took a cautious sip, and for a moment they both just listened to the quiet tick of the clock. "It's nice," he admitted. "Soothing," Mary nodded. "That's what I thought, but it's more than that. It's helping me sleep. It's calming me down in ways I didn't expect." She paused, her voice softening. "And I think it's healing me." Thomas leaned back, studying her face. "Healing?" She met his gaze steadily. "Yes, not in a dramatic way. But little by little, it's taking away the edge, the heaviness I didn't even realize I was carrying." She didn't tell him yet about the way her dreams had returned, soft, drifting dreams she hadn't had in years. She wanted to keep that part for herself a little longer, like a secret garden she wasn't ready to show. Later that evening, as Mary brewed her nightly cup, she thought about how many people pass by such simple remedies every day without noticing. In the supermarket, chamomile tea sat quietly on the shelves, sandwiched between peppermint and green tea, waiting to be chosen. How many shoppers, she wondered, thought of it only as something to sip on a sick day or when the weather turned chilly? How many overlooked it entirely? She realized she had been one of them for years. And yet here she was, finding comfort and renewal in its delicate petals. The next morning, she decided to write in her journal again, something she hadn't done in months. She described the tea's golden color, the way it seemed to hold the sun in its depths. She wrote about the calm it brought her, about how it felt like a gentle friend sitting across the table, listening without judgment. Her words flowed easily, as though the tea had unlocked a part of her that had been silent for too long. That afternoon, she met her friend Alice for their usual walk. Alice was quick to notice Mary's lighter step. "You seem different," she remarked. Mary laughed. "It's the tea," she said, half joking but entirely sincere. Alice gave her a curious look. Tea can't change a person that much, Mary only smiled. Perhaps it's not just the tea. Perhaps it's the ritual, the slowing down, the choosing to care for myself. Alice didn't argue, but Mary could tell she was thinking about it. When Mary returned home, she made a decision. She would make chamomile tea a part of her life, not just for a week, but for as long as it continued to bring her this sense of ease. She would treat it not as a quick fix, but as a companion on her journey to better health. The idea filled her with a quiet determination. She had spent too long pushing through tiredness, dismissing her own needs. Now she wanted to listen to herself, to her body, to the small whispers of well-being that so often went unheard. That night, she placed the kettle on the stove and watched as the water began to hum. She measured the flowers carefully, letting them fall into the cup like tiny blessings. As she poured the hot water, the scent rose up to meet her, warm and sweet. She breathed it in deeply, letting it settle in her chest. Then she carried the cup to her favorite chair, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and sipped slowly. Each swallow felt like a promise that she would keep making time for herself, that she would honor the small things that made her feel whole. Outside, the world went about its busy business. Cars passed, lights flickered on in windows, the distant bark of a dog broke the quiet. But inside Mary's cottage, there was only the gentle rhythm of her breath, the fading warmth of the cup in her hands, and the steady knowledge that she had found something worth keeping. And though she didn't yet know all the ways it would change her life, she had a feeling this was only the beginning. The first time Mary mentioned chamomile tea to her doctor, Dr. Evelyn Hart, she half expected a polite smile and a quick change of subject. After all, in Mary's experience, doctors often leaned on prescriptions and clinical treatments rather than kitchen cupboard remedies. But to her surprise, Dr. Hart's eyes softened and she leaned back in her chair. Chamomile? She repeated thoughtfully. Now, that is a good choice. Mary raised her brows. You approve? The doctor chuckled. My grandmother swore by it, and, truth be told, I've recommended it to a number of my patients over the years, especially those who struggle with sleep and stress. It's an old remedy, but it has a way of working gently and steadily. Mary was curious. So it's not just something people drink for comfort? Dr. Hart shook her head. It's been part of natural medicine for thousands of years. The ancient Egyptians used chamomile to treat fevers. The Romans believed it could heal wounds. And herbalists in Europe have treasured it for calming the nerves and soothing the stomach. It's one of those plants that has stood the test of time. Hearing this filled Mary with a strange warmth. It was as though she had joined a long, unbroken chain of people who had sipped this tea through centuries, trusting it to bring them peace. She liked the idea that somewhere in the past, another woman, perhaps tired from her own worries, had sat by the fire holding a steaming cup of chamomile just like Mary did now. That evening, she told Alice about her doctor's response over their weekly phone call. Alice was skeptical at first. I thought all those old herbal remedies were just, well, old wives' tales, she said. Mary smiled into the receiver. Some are, but this one, even my doctor thinks it's worth keeping. Alice hesitated, then asked, So, do you think it's actually helping you because of the tea or because you believe it is? Mary thought about that for a moment. Maybe both, she admitted. But you know what? I don't really care. All I know is I'm sleeping better, I'm calmer, and my mornings don't feel like a battle. And if something has been helping people for centuries, I think there's a reason for it. Over the next few weeks, Mary began to treat her chamomile ritual with a kind of reverence. She chose her teacup with care each night, sometimes the floral porcelain one she'd inherited from her mother, sometimes the sturdy stoneware mug she'd bought at a craft fair years ago. She started boiling the water in her old stovetop kettle rather than the electric one, just for the pleasure of hearing the whistle. In these quiet minutes, she felt connected to something much older than herself. She pictured the herb growing under the sun, its delicate white petals surrounding a bright yellow center, nodding gently in the breeze. She imagined the hands that picked it, the careful drying of the blossoms, the way the scent deepened as they were stored away. She thought about the journey those tiny flowers had taken from a distant field to her own small kitchen and felt grateful. One rainy afternoon, Mary decided to visit the town library. She wandered into the section on herbal medicine and found a thick, worn book on the history of medicinal plants. Settling into a chair by the window, she turned the pages slowly, her fingers tracing the illustrations. There was chamomile, Matricaria chamomilla, in all its humble beauty. The entry spoke of its use in ancient Greece, of its role in soothing soldiers after long marches, of its inclusion in the gardens of medieval monasteries. Mary learned that matricaria came from the Latin word for womb, reflecting the plant's historic use in easing women's ailments. She read about its gentle, anti-inflammatory effects, its reputation for calming both the body and the spirit, and she found herself smiling at a passage that described chamomile as the plant physician for other herbs, believed to help neighboring plants grow stronger when planted nearby. That idea stayed with her. Perhaps, she thought, chamomile had a way of nurturing not only gardens but people as well, quietly, without demanding attention. When she got home that day, she brewed herself a cup and sat by the window, listening to the rain tap against the glass. She thought about the wisdom of those who came before her, people who had trusted in nature's offerings long before science could explain why they worked. She thought about how, in her younger years, she had been too busy to notice such things. The next time she saw Dr. Hart, she brought along a small packet of dried chamomile flowers. "For you," she said, handing it over with a smile. The doctor laughed softly. "You know," she said, "I might just make myself a cup tonight." That evening, Mary wrote in her journal again. She wrote about the satisfaction of finding something that didn't just treat a symptom, but touched her life in a deeper way. She wrote about how it reminded her of her mother's quiet wisdom, of evenings spent in the soft glow of lamplight, of the comfort found in small, steady rituals. She realized she was no longer just drinking chamomile tea. She was keeping a promise to herself, to live with more gentleness, to honor the old wisdom that still held meaning, and to let herself be cared for in the simplest of ways. And as the tea cooled in her hands, Mary knew she had stumbled onto something worth sharing, not as a prescription, but as a story about a humble flower, a long tradition, and the quiet magic that happens when you open your life to both. Mary had never thought of herself as a science-minded person. Numbers, chemical formulas, laboratory terms, they had always seemed distant, belonging to another world. But as the weeks passed and her evening ritual with chamomile deepened, she found herself growing curious about why this tiny flower worked so well. It wasn't enough anymore to simply know it helped her. She wanted to understand the mystery inside each golden blossom. One morning, while sipping her tea at the kitchen table, she opened her laptop and typed in "Chamomile Health Benefits Scientific Studies." She expected vague articles and folk wisdom, but what she found was surprisingly solid. There were studies from universities she recognized, journals filled with research, even references from modern medical websites. Over and over, she saw the same words: apigenin, flavonoids, antioxidants. She clicked on one study that caught her attention. It explained that chamomile flowers contained a natural compound called apigenin, which could bind to receptors in the brain, encouraging the body to relax and drift into sleep. Another article described how chamomile's antioxidants reduced inflammation, supported liver function, and even promoted better digestion. Mary leaned back in her chair, almost smiling to herself. So it wasn't just a pretty story, there was real science behind it. That evening, she mentioned her discovery to Thomas when he stopped by with a basket of fresh bread from the bakery. "Did you know," she began, handing him a slice, "that chamomile actually contains compounds that help the brain wind down? It's not just in my head. Well, actually, it is in my head, but you know what I mean." Thomas laughed, shaking his head. "Next thing you know, you'll be wearing a lab coat." Mary grinned. "Maybe not a lab coat, but it feels good to know this isn't just a superstition. I suppose it's like finding out your grandmother's favorite recipe is also approved by nutritionists. You enjoy it even more." She noticed that learning about the science gave her a new respect for her nightly cup. It wasn't only a comforting ritual, it was an act of nourishment. Each sip carried molecules that worked quietly inside her, easing the tension in her mind, calming the muscles in her stomach, soothing her body into balance. And somehow, knowing this made the tea taste even sweeter. A few days later, Mary decided to bring up her research with Dr. Hart. "I've been reading about chamomile," she said during her appointment. "It's fascinating. I never realized it could do so much." The doctor smiled. "That's one of the beautiful things about certain plants. They work in ways we're still learning about. Chamomile is gentle enough for daily use, yet powerful in its own quiet way. That's rare." Mary thought about that on the way home. It reminded her of the children she'd taught over the years, the quiet ones who rarely raised their hands but surprised everyone with their insight when they did speak. Chamomile was like that, unassuming but deeply capable. That evening, she decided to take her tea into the garden. The sun was setting, and the air carried that cool, earthy scent that only came at the end of a warm day. As she sipped, she imagined the journey of the apigenin in her tea, from the flower to the hot water, then into her bloodstream, making its way to her brain like a soft lullaby. The thought made her smile. Alice called later that night. "I can hear it in your voice," Alice said after a few minutes of chatting. "You sound lighter." Mary told her about the science she'd discovered, the studies she'd read. Alice listened quietly before saying, "So you're telling me there's actual proof this little flower can help people sleep and heal?" Mary's voice warmed. "Yes, and that makes me want to share it even more. Because if it helped me this much, maybe it can help others too." They talked about how so many people overlooked small, natural remedies simply because they seemed too ordinary. "We're trained to look for big solutions," Mary mused, "but sometimes the best medicine is quiet and small and right under our noses." That night, she brewed her tea a little earlier than usual. She wanted to savor the process, knowing now that each petal carried something measurable, something proven. She poured the hot water over the flowers and inhaled the steam, feeling the connection between tradition and science swirl around her. As she settled into her chair, the rain began again outside, tapping softly on the window. Mary thought about all the people through the centuries who had discovered chamomile's gifts without knowing the names of its compounds or the diagrams of its molecular structure. They didn't need scientific proof. They had the proof of their own bodies. And now she had both. When she finally set down her empty cup, she realized she felt a sense of peace that went beyond the calm the tea usually brought. It was the peace of understanding, of feeling part of a longer story, one that wove together ancient wisdom and modern science in a way that made her believe even more deeply in what she had found. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth linger in her chest, and thought to herself, "This tiny flower has given me back my nights, and maybe, just maybe, it's giving me something even greater: hope." Mary had once accepted restless nights as just another part of aging. She thought it was normal to wake 3 or 4 times, shifting in bed, staring at the faint glow of the clock. But now, weeks into her chamomile ritual, her nights were changing in ways she hadn't expected. It began subtly. She would wake once in the night instead of 3 times. The next week, she found herself opening her eyes to daylight without remembering a single interruption. It felt like she had been wrapped in a gentle, uninterrupted dream from evening until morning. Her mornings were no longer heavy with that foggy feeling that used to cling to her like a damp coat. One night, she noticed something even more surprising. She had begun to dream again. Not the quick, anxious flashes she had sometimes experienced, but real dreams full of color and story. She dreamed of walking along the beach with her late husband, his hand warm in hers. She dreamed of her childhood home, the smell of fresh bread drifting from the kitchen. Waking from those dreams left her with a bittersweet comfort, like visiting an old friend for a short while. On a rainy afternoon, she told Alice about the dreams over the phone. "It's as if the tea is opening a door I forgot existed," Mary said softly. "I'm resting in a way I haven't for years. And the strangest thing is, I wake up wanting to get up, not dreading it." Alice chuckled. "Imagine that. A flower in hot water is giving you back your mornings." Mary smiled. "It's not just the flower, it's the way I treat myself now. I stop rushing in the evenings. I light a candle sometimes. I tell my body, it's time to rest now. And it listens." That evening, she decided to make the moment even more special. She took out the teacup her husband had given her on their 10th anniversary, a delicate porcelain cup painted with tiny blue forget-me-nots. She had kept it tucked away for years, afraid it might chip, but tonight it felt right. She placed the chamomile flowers in it, poured the steaming water, and watched the petals swirl gently before settling at the bottom. As she sipped, she thought about how much of life's beauty she had once hurried past. Meals eaten quickly, evenings spent answering the phone or folding laundry instead of pausing. This cup of tea had become a small ceremony, a quiet act of reclaiming her time. And perhaps that was why it was working so well. By the 4th week, the change was undeniable. Thomas noticed it when he stopped by to drop off a book. "Mary," he said, peering at her closely, "you look like you've been on a holiday. Did you go somewhere and not tell me? She laughed, shaking her head. No, Thomas, I've just been sleeping. He raised an eyebrow. Sleeping can do all that? Mary took a slow sip before answering. When you haven't had it in years, yes, it can. Dr. Hart noticed it too at Mary's next visit. You're brighter, she said, glancing at Mary's chart. Your blood pressure is steadier, and you've lost that tired look in your eyes. Mary told her about the dreams, the mornings that felt lighter, the joy of simply getting out of bed without dragging her feet. Dr. Hart nodded approvingly. That's the power of restorative sleep. It's not just about feeling rested, it's about your body repairing itself, your mind settling. Keep doing what you're doing. Encouraged, Mary leaned even more into her nighttime ritual. She dimmed the lights an hour before bed, sometimes playing soft instrumental music. She turned off the television earlier, replacing it with a chapter from an old novel or a quiet moment by the window, watching the moon rise. And always, there was the tea, its gentle steam, a signal that the day was closing and peace was on its way. She began to notice something else as well. Her days felt easier. The afternoon slump that used to send her reaching for coffee now passed without much notice. She moved through her chores with a calm focus. Even her walks felt different, as if her legs had more spring. Sleep had not just transformed her nights, it was quietly reshaping her days. One evening, as she cradled her cup, Mary reflected on the irony of it all. She had tried expensive sleep supplements before, even considered prescription sleeping pills, but they always left her groggy or unsettled. Now, here she was, finding the most profound change in something so ordinary, so humble. When Alice visited one weekend, Mary poured her a cup of chamomile tea. They sat together in the garden, the evening sun painting the sky in soft gold. Alice took a sip, closing her eyes. It does feel different, she admitted. There's something safe about it. Mary smiled knowingly. That's exactly how it feels to me. Like I'm telling myself, you're safe now. You can let go. As the light faded, Mary realized her nights were no longer something to dread. They had become something to look forward to. And in a way, that was the greatest transformation of all, turning what had been a battle into a gift. She didn't know where this journey with chamomile would take her next, but she knew one thing for certain. It had given her back her nights, and with them, a part of herself she thought she had lost forever. Mary had grown used to her new evening rhythm, yet each night still felt like a quiet discovery. What she once saw as just a cup of tea had become her anchor, a signal to her mind and body that the day's demands had ended. And though her sleep had improved remarkably, she was beginning to notice something deeper. The small, steady sense of peace the ritual brought even before she closed her eyes. It was early spring now, and the evenings carried a soft coolness through her open kitchen window. One evening, as the kettle began to hum, Mary felt the familiar anticipation build. She measured out the chamomile flowers, letting them fall into the cup with a soft rustle. The scent rose almost immediately, sweet, calming, like a gentle hand on her shoulder. She realized the comfort didn't wait for the tea to touch her lips. It began here, in the preparation itself. She thought back to the restless nights that had plagued her not so long ago, the tossing and turning, the racing thoughts, the frustration of staring at the ceiling, knowing dawn would come too soon. Back then, bedtime felt like walking into a storm without an umbrella. Now, her nights began with a steadying pause. She no longer feared the hours ahead, she welcomed them. One particularly windy evening, Thomas stopped by to return a book. Seeing her at the kitchen counter, he grinned. "Making your magic potion again?" She laughed. "Every night, it's my gentle cure for restless sleep." He pulled out a chair, watching as she poured hot water over the blossoms. "You really believe this has made the difference?" She met his eyes. "Thomas, I'm not just sleeping better, I'm living better. The tea is part of it, but so is the quiet, the slowing down, the way it reminds me I'm allowed to rest." Mary didn't tell him about the small details she'd come to cherish. The way she cupped her hands around the steaming mug, the way she felt her shoulders drop with the first inhale, the soft warmth that spread down her chest with the first sip. These moments were private, like whispered reassurances she gave herself. And they mattered. Her doctor noticed the change again at her next visit. "Your blood pressure's excellent," Dr. Hart said, flipping through her chart. "And your sleep logs look steady." Mary smiled. "It's the tea, but more than that, it's the peace that comes with it." The doctor nodded. "Rituals matter. They teach your body what to expect. And with chamomile, you're giving it a gentle, natural nudge in the right direction. Mary had never thought of herself as someone who thrived on routine. In her teaching years, her days were often unpredictable. Students needing extra help, last-minute lesson changes, sudden parent meetings. She'd learned to adapt quickly, to keep moving. But now, in this quieter chapter of life, she saw the gift of predictable rhythms. They didn't feel restrictive, they felt like home. One Saturday, Alice came to spend the night. They hadn't had a sleepover since they were young mothers, staying up late over coffee and whispered worries about their children. This time, Mary set the tone differently. After dinner, she dimmed the lights and brought out the chamomile. "We drink this before bed," she told Alice with mock seriousness. "House rules." Alice laughed but accepted the cup. "It smells lovely," she said, blowing gently on the steam. They sipped in silence for a moment, listening to the distant rustle of the wind in the garden. "You know," Alice said softly, "there's something about this. It makes you feel like the day is truly done." Mary smiled. "Exactly. It's like a good night hug you give yourself." Later, as they settled into their beds, Alice surprised her. "I can see why you do this. I feel calmer already. If I slept like this every night, I think I'd be a different person." Mary chuckled. It's never too late to start. In the weeks that followed, Mary found herself looking forward to bedtime in a way she never had before. Her days still had their share of small stresses, an unexpected bill, a leaky faucet, a stubborn jar lid, but she no longer carried them into the night. The tea gave her permission to set them down. Some nights, she would take her cup out to the porch and watch the stars, the steam curling into the night air. Other nights, she stayed by the fire, the glow matching the warmth in her hands. Always, she felt the same, a gentle unwinding, as if each sip loosened another knot inside her. It occurred to her one evening that this wasn't just about sleep. It was about how she lived the hours before it. Restless nights, she realized, were often born from restless days. Chamomile had become her way of slowing the current, of reminding herself that she could drift instead of fight. And in that drifting, she found rest. When Alice called again weeks later, she confessed she'd started her own chamomile ritual. "It's working," she said happily. "I haven't slept like this in years." Mary felt a quiet satisfaction. It wasn't just about sharing a tip, it was about sharing a way of being, a softer way to meet the night. And so, Mary kept her promise to herself. Each evening, she brewed her gentle cure, knowing it was more than a drink. It was her way of telling the day goodbye, her way of greeting the night with open hands instead of clenched fists. And each morning, she woke with gratitude, knowing that what had once been broken, her sleep, her peace, was slowly being mended, one cup at a time. Mary had always thought of her chamomile tea as a nighttime ally, a warm, golden cup that closed her day. But as the weeks passed, she began to notice something unexpected. Its influence was seeping into her daylight hours. It wasn't just that she slept better and woke rested. Her mind felt lighter, clearer, and far less prone to the small storms that used to stir so easily inside her. It was a Tuesday morning when she first realized the shift. The day had started with one of those minor domestic disasters. Her washing machine refused to start, and a faint smell of damp laundry drifted from the laundry room. Months ago, this small inconvenience would have left her grumbling, tense for the rest of the day, but now she simply unplugged the machine, opened the windows, and phoned a repairman. "It'll get fixed when it gets fixed," she thought, and then she went back to buttering her toast without that familiar knot in her stomach. She wondered if it was the tea or simply the byproduct of better sleep, but deep down, she suspected it was both. The chamomile had become more than a bedtime drink. It was a daily reminder to let go, to breathe, to soften her grip on life's small irritations. On her afternoon walk that day, she stopped by the park bench near the pond. The early spring sun sparkled on the water, and a pair of ducks paddled lazily past. Mary sat for longer than usual, just watching them, listening to the quiet splash of their movements. She realized she hadn't checked her watch once. Time for that moment felt wide and unhurried. The next morning, Alice called. "You sound chipper," she said immediately. "What's your secret?" Mary chuckled. "It's the tea." Alice laughed. "You and your tea. You should write a book." But Mary only smiled. "You know, it's strange. Drinking it makes me feel calmer even in the daytime. It's like I carry a little piece of that nighttime peace with me." That afternoon, she looked up more about chamomile's effect on mood. She read that it wasn't just a placebo effect. Chamomile's gentle compounds could actually help lower cortisol levels, the stress hormone that so often ran rampant in busy modern lives. Some studies even suggested it had mild antidepressant qualities. Mary found herself nodding at the screen. She could believe it. The way she moved through her days now felt steadier, like walking on a smooth path instead of one littered with pebbles. One Thursday, Thomas dropped by with a grocery bag in hand. "Thought you might need a top-up," he said, handing her a fresh packet of dried chamomile flowers. She thanked him, touched by the gesture. Over tea, they talked about how life seemed to speed up without anyone noticing. "We fill every gap with something," Thomas said. "Phones, TV, errands. No wonder people are always wound up." Mary agreed. "But when I sit with my tea, it's like the world slows just enough for me to catch my breath, and that's when I remember what matters." Later that evening, Mary decided to do something new. She brewed her chamomile earlier than usual, around sunset, and carried it out to the garden. The sky was streaked with gold and pink, the air cool but soft. She wrapped her hands around the mug and inhaled deeply, feeling the day's noise dissolve. She thought about all the little worries that had once cluttered her mind: bills, errands, household repairs, and how none of them seemed to hold the same weight anymore. The change was most obvious during her weekly visits with her sister, Anne. Anne had a way of worrying about everything, and their conversations often circled around health scares, news headlines, and what-if scenarios. But now, Mary found herself gently steering the talks toward lighter ground. Books they'd read, memories from their childhood, the flowers blooming in Anne's garden. Anne noticed. "You're different lately," she said one afternoon, eyeing her sister with a curious smile. "You don't seem as frazzled." Mary laughed softly. "I've learned to drink my calm," she said, lifting an imaginary cup. Even her evenings felt transformed. Where she once spent them flipping through television channels, restless and distracted, she now savored the quiet. Sometimes she read by lamplight. Sometimes she wrote letters, real, handwritten letters, to friends she hadn't spoken to in years. She found joy in these small acts, in the way they kept her grounded in the present. The biggest surprise came one weekend when Alice visited again. They were sitting in the garden after breakfast, mugs in hand, when Alice said, "You know, you seem happier than you have in a long time. Not just rested, happier." Mary thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "I think I am. I've stopped rushing through my life. And I think the tea helped me see that I could." That night, after Alice had gone home, Mary sat by the window with her cup. The moon hung low and luminous, the air filled with the soft hum of crickets. She thought about how strange and beautiful it was that a small flower could do so much, not just for her sleep, but for her spirit. It was like a quiet friend that sat beside her, reminding her to breathe, to slow down, to savor the good that was already here. And as she drained the last sip, she realized this wasn't just about tea anymore. It was about learning how to meet the day with an open heart, about carrying a pocket of peace wherever she went. Chamomile had simply shown her the way. Mary had always thought of chamomile tea as a comfort drink, gentle, calming, a friend at the end of the day. But she hadn't considered that it might hold benefits beyond better sleep and a lighter mood. That changed one Saturday morning when she stopped by the herbal shop in town to pick up another packet of dried blossoms. The shopkeeper, Mrs. Rowan, was an energetic woman in her 70s with a knowing smile. As she weighed out the flowers, she asked, "Have you noticed anything else since you started drinking chamomile?" Mary thought for a moment. "Well, my digestion's calmer, and I feel more at ease in general. But why do you ask?" Mrs. Rowan lowered her voice, as though about to share a personal secret. "It's been a friend to women for centuries, helps with cramps, eases hormonal swings, even makes those heavier days a bit more bearable." Mary raised an eyebrow. "I'm well past that stage," she said with a small laugh. Mrs. Rowan nodded knowingly. "True, but hormones still shift, even later in life. And chamomile's anti-inflammatory touch can help with all sorts of little discomforts." She went on to tell Mary how her own daughter had used chamomile tea during her younger years to ease menstrual cramps, and how it seemed to smooth the sharp edges of her moods. "It's a quiet ally," she said, handing Mary the neatly wrapped bundle. "Most people don't even know it's working until they look back." Walking home with the packet tucked under her arm, Mary thought about the women she'd known over the years, friends, students, family, each carrying their own hidden aches and imbalances. She thought of her younger self, pushing through painful days, always putting others first. How different might those days have been if she'd had a small, steady comfort waiting in her teacup. That evening, she called her niece Clara, who had been juggling work and motherhood. Clara sounded tired. "The boys have been wild today," she sighed, "and my back's been acting up again." Mary hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever drink chamomile tea?" Clara laughed. "Only when I'm sick." Mary told her about her own experience, about Mrs. Rowan's wisdom, about how this little flower had been quietly supporting women for centuries. Clara listened, and Mary could almost hear her smile over the phone. "Maybe I'll try it," she said. Later, Mary brewed her own cup, wondering about the ways women had passed such knowledge from one generation to the next. She remembered her grandmother's kitchen, where jars of dried herbs lined the shelves and remedies were spoken of in low, certain tones. Back then, she hadn't paid much attention. Now she wished she'd listened more closely. Over the next few weeks, Mary began to notice little changes she hadn't thought to connect with the tea. Her joints felt less stiff in the mornings. The occasional bloating that had bothered her after certain meals seemed to ease more quickly. And when she did feel moments of irritability, those small waves that still came now and then, they seemed to pass like a breeze instead of settling like a storm. One afternoon, Alice came by for a visit. They were sitting in the sunroom, teacups in hand, when Alice sighed. "I wish I'd known about this years ago. You know how awful my cramps used to be?" Mary nodded. "I do. And apparently chamomile could have helped." Alice looked at her in mock outrage. "And you're telling me this now?" They both laughed, but the moment felt more meaningful than the humor suggested. They were part of a generation of women who had endured quietly, thinking discomfort was just their lot in life. Mary began to wonder how many other women might be quietly struggling with aches, mood shifts, or restless nights, things that might be eased, even if only a little, by something as simple as chamomile. She found herself talking about it more, slipping it into conversations with friends at the market, neighbors on the street. "It's not a miracle," she would say with a small shrug, "but it's a kindness, and we could all use a bit more of that." One Sunday morning, she sat at her kitchen table with her journal open. The steam from her tea curled upward, and she found herself writing about the ways women carried each other's burdens through quiet acts. A casserole left at the doorstep, a phone call on a hard day, a recipe passed down with a story attached. And now, perhaps, a packet of chamomile flowers shared with the hope of making life just a little softer. It struck her that chamomile's gift wasn't just in what it did for the body. It was in the way it reminded her that care didn't have to be grand or complicated. Sometimes it was as small as a cup of tea offered with understanding. Sometimes that was enough to remind a person they weren't alone. That night, as she sipped from her favorite blue forget-me-not cup, she thought of the women in her life, the ones still here and the ones she'd lost. She imagined them all gathered at her table, laughter and conversation weaving through the steam from their mugs. And she realized with a warm ache in her chest that the tea was more than a drink. It was a thread connecting her to a long line of women who had quietly, steadfastly cared for themselves and for each other. And in that moment, Mary knew that chamomile had become more than her nightly ritual. It was part of her story now, a story she would keep sharing, one cup at a time. It was during a routine checkup that Mary first heard her doctor mention the word liver in a tone that made her listen more closely. Dr. Hart flipped through the lab results with a practiced hand, then looked up. "Your numbers aren't alarming," she said gently, "but they're not perfect either. As we get older, our livers work harder than we realize, filtering toxins, breaking down medications, managing our energy balance. It's worth giving it a little extra care." Mary had never thought much about her liver. It was one of those invisible organs she assumed would keep doing its job quietly in the background. She sipped her water and asked, "And how exactly do I care for my liver?" Dr. Hart smiled. "The basics. Stay hydrated, watch the sugar and alcohol, eat plenty of greens. But here's something you might appreciate. Chamomile tea has shown promise in helping reduce liver inflammation and improving function over time. It's not a cure-all, but it's a gentle supporter." Mary blinked in surprise. "My tea? The one I already drink every night?" The doctor nodded. "The very same. Keep it up. Your liver will thank you." Walking home, Mary thought about how remarkable it was that her humble bedtime ritual was already working quietly in ways she hadn't even realized. She pictured her liver, that uncelebrated worker deep inside her, quietly processing everything she ate and drank, sorting through the good and the harmful. And now she imagined the chamomile arriving like a kind co-worker, easing the load, soothing the stress. That evening, she mentioned it to Thomas over the garden fence. "Apparently, my tea is taking care of my liver," she said with a small smile. He chuckled. "Well, isn't that efficient? You're getting sleep, peace of mind, and now liver care, all for the price of a tea bag." Mary grinned. "It's the best bargain I've ever made." Curious, she began reading more about the connection. She found studies describing chamomile's antioxidants, how they could reduce oxidative stress, the quiet wear and tear that damage cells over time. She read about how it helped reduce fat buildup in the liver, especially important for people her age. The more she read, the more she felt a quiet pride in her nightly habit. She wasn't just enjoying tea, she was making a long-term investment in her health. One Saturday morning at the farmer's market, she stopped by a stand selling fresh herbs. The vendor, a cheerful man with a weathered hat, noticed the chamomile bundle in her hand. "Ah, liver's friend," he said knowingly. Mary tilted her head. "You know about that?" He nodded. "Grew up with my grandmother telling me to drink it after heavy meals. Said it kept the body light." Mary smiled. Seemed she was right. That night, Mary decided to make her tea with even more care. She used her little glass teapot, letting the flowers float freely before settling. She took the time to watch the water turn a warm, golden hue. When she finally poured it into her cup, she imagined it working its way through her body, soothing her mind, easing her heart, and yes, quietly tending to her liver. A few weeks later, she went back for her follow-up. Dr. Hart scanned the numbers and looked pleased. "Better," she said. "Not dramatic, but steady improvement. Keep doing what you're doing." Mary felt a quiet wave of satisfaction. For years, she'd assumed her health depended solely on big changes, strict diets, intense exercise regimens. Now she saw how small, gentle acts could add up to real, measurable difference. She told Alice about it during one of their long phone calls. "You're making me want to drink chamomile in the morning and at night," Alice said. Mary laughed. "Why not? Twice the care, twice the comfort." They spent the next few minutes reminiscing about the remedies their mothers had used: hot lemon water for colds, ginger tea for upset stomachs, and how many of them had been quietly effective without the fuss of modern trends. One afternoon, as Mary sat with her journal, she wrote, "Taking care of myself doesn't have to be loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's a cup of tea. And that's enough." She realized her relationship with her health had shifted. She no longer felt at war with her body, trying to fix it. Instead, she felt in partnership with it, offering it small kindnesses every day. Chamomile had become more than a habit. It was a conversation she had with herself, one that said, "I see you, I value you, I'm here to help." And as she drained the last sip of her tea that night, Mary smiled to herself. She knew she would keep drinking it, not just for the sleep, not just for the calm, but for the unseen work it was doing inside her, protecting her sip by sip, one quiet night at a time. If you'd like, I can now continue with Part 9, Easing Digestion the Natural Way, where Mary notices chamomile's gentle effect on her stomach and finds it becomes her go-to comfort after meals. Do you want me to continue to 1,000 words for Part 9 now? Ban John Noy, continue to 1,000 words for Part 9. ChatGPT John Noy. Here's Part 9, Easing Digestion the Natural Way. At Part 1,000 words, continuing Mary's story in the same warm, flowing tone. Mary had always had what she called a sensitive stomach. Over the years, she'd grown used to little bouts of discomfort after certain meals, especially heavier ones. A lingering fullness, a bit of bloating, the occasional cramp that made her press her palm lightly against her side. It was never enough to send her rushing to the doctor, but enough to cast a small shadow over her evenings. One Sunday afternoon, after a big family lunch, that familiar discomfort returned. She had enjoyed every bite, roast chicken, buttery potatoes, and a slice of her niece's apple tart, but now, sitting in her armchair, she could feel her body struggling to settle. She considered the usual remedies: a slow walk around the block, a hot water bottle on her stomach. Then her eyes drifted to the packet of chamomile flowers on the kitchen counter. She'd been reading, after her talk with Dr. Hart, about chamomile's effects beyond sleep and liver health. One article described its ability to relax the smooth muscles in the digestive tract, easing cramps and encouraging food to move along gently. The idea made sense to her. After all, she'd already noticed how it calmed her mind at night. Perhaps it could do the same for her stomach. So she rose, filled the kettle, and measured out a small spoonful of the golden blossoms. As the water boiled, she found herself slowing down, letting the simple act of making tea become part of the remedy. She poured the steaming water over the flowers and waited, inhaling the sweet, apple-like scent that rose with the steam. By the time she took her first sip, she could feel the tightness in her belly beginning to ease, not gone, but softening as though someone had loosened a knot. Over the next few weeks, Mary began making chamomile tea after heavier meals, especially in the evenings. It wasn't dramatic, but the difference was real. The post-meal heaviness no longer lingered for hours. The bloating that sometimes made her unfasten her waistband faded more quickly. And perhaps most important, she no longer worried quite so much about discomfort stealing the rest of her evening. One day she mentioned it to Thomas when he stopped by with fresh bread. "You know," she said, pouring him a cup, "this isn't just for bedtime anymore. I've started drinking it after meals." He raised an eyebrow. "Like a digestive aid?" Mary nodded. "Exactly. It's like it helps everything settle in its proper place." Thomas sipped thoughtfully. "I might try that. My Sunday dinners do seem to sit a bit heavier these days." Mary smiled. "Just don't expect fireworks. It's not a quick jolt. It's a gentle shift, the kind you notice more in how you feel an hour later." Her friend Alice noticed too. They were at the cafe one afternoon when Mary declined dessert, saying she'd rather save room for her tea later. "It really makes that much difference?" Alice asked. "It does," Mary replied simply. "And it feels like I'm helping my body instead of ignoring it." She began to pair the tea with other small habits, taking a slower pace at the table, putting her fork down between bites, choosing lighter dressings instead of heavy sauces. These weren't rules, just choices that felt right. And together, they worked quietly to make her evenings easier. One afternoon at the library, Mary found a book on herbal traditions from around the world. She smiled to read that in parts of the Mediterranean, chamomile tea after dinner was as common as coffee or wine. It wasn't just for taste, it was understood to be good for the stomach, a final soothing note to close the meal. She liked that idea. Meals weren't meant to end in discomfort, but in contentment. She thought about the many nights she'd gone to bed with a full, unsettled stomach, tossing and turning as her body tried to digest. Those nights were becoming rare now, and she realized it wasn't only the chamomile, it was the way she was learning to listen. If she felt a twinge of discomfort, she responded. If she knew a meal might be heavier than usual, she planned for it. The tea had become her way of saying, "I hear you," to her own body. One evening, after a particularly rich holiday dinner at her sister Anne's house, Mary returned home with that familiar heaviness. She didn't fret. Instead, she lit a small candle, brewed her chamomile, and sipped it slowly in the quiet of her kitchen. The warmth seemed to spread downward, untangling the knots, replacing the fullness with a softer, more comfortable calm. She slept soundly that night. As the months passed, chamomile became as much a part of her dining routine as setting the table. Sometimes she even offered it to guests after a meal. Most accepted politely. A few returned weeks later to tell her they'd adopted the habit themselves. "It's a gentle end to the day," she would tell them. "It helps you feel cared for, even in small ways." And one rainy evening, as she stood at the window with her cup, watching the drops trace slow paths down the glass, Mary realized this was exactly what chamomile had taught her. To approach her body with gentleness, to soothe instead of scold, to support instead of push. And in return, her body was learning to trust her again, one quiet sip at a time. It was late autumn when Mary first began thinking about her immune health more seriously. The days were shorter, the air held a sharp chill, and the news seemed to be full of reminders about seasonal illnesses making the rounds. Normally, she would stock up on oranges, honey, and a few bottles of vitamin supplements. But this year felt different. This year, she already had a quiet ally sitting on her kitchen shelf. It started one evening when she was reading an article in the local paper about natural immune boosters. Near the bottom of the page, almost as an afterthought, was a paragraph about chamomile. It mentioned studies showing chamomile's antibacterial properties, how the plant's natural compounds could inhibit the growth of certain bacteria, even some that cause stubborn infections. Mary's eyes lingered on the words Staphylococcus aureus. She remembered hearing that name years ago when a friend had a difficult-to-treat skin infection. The idea fascinated her. Here she was, drinking this tea every day for her sleep, mood, digestion, and even her liver, and it might also be quietly defending her from harmful bacteria. She thought of it like an unseen bodyguard, keeping watch even while she went about her day. She decided to ask Dr. Hart about it at her next appointment. "Is it true?" she asked as soon as she sat down. "That chamomile can protect you from bacteria?" Dr. Hart smiled at her enthusiasm. "There's evidence to support it. Chamomile contains natural, essential oils that have mild antibacterial effects. It's not a replacement for medical treatment if you're sick, of course, but it can certainly be a helpful part of your overall defense, especially when you drink it regularly." Mary left the clinic feeling oddly reassured. She liked the thought of doing something for her health that wasn't harsh or complicated. It fit her philosophy perfectly. Small, gentle actions, done consistently, could have a deep impact. The following week, when Thomas stopped by with a loaf of bread, she couldn't resist sharing. "You know," she said as she handed him a steaming cup, "this tea isn't just for sleep and calm. It's also a bit of a shield." Thomas chuckled. "A shield?" She nodded. "Against bacteria. Imagine that, a tiny flower helping you fight off the bad stuff." He took a sip, raising his brows. "Well, I'll be sure to keep my shield polished." Mary began thinking about all the ways chamomile had been with her through the year. It had seen her through restless nights, eased her digestion, soothed her mood, and now it was quietly working behind the scenes to help protect her health. She remembered reading how in some traditional households, chamomile tea was offered to anyone feeling a bit off, not because it cured everything, but because it supported the body's own resilience. That resonated with her deeply. One evening, after returning from a damp and chilly walk, she brewed an extra strong cup. She let it steep a little longer than usual, watching the water deepen to a rich golden hue. The steam rose around her face, carrying that familiar, sweet, apple-like scent. She imagined it working its way through her body, not just bringing her peace, but also reinforcing her defenses. Her friend Alice called later that night. "I think I'm coming down with something," Alice groaned. Sore throat, a bit achy. Without missing a beat, Mary said, "Make yourself a strong chamomile tea before bed. It won't cure it overnight, but it might help your body fight it off." Alice laughed softly. "You and your tea. You're like a walking advertisement." Mary grinned into the phone. Not an ad, just a believer. As the weeks passed and winter crept closer, Mary kept her evening ritual without fail. She also began to add the tea to her afternoons on colder days. She liked the feeling of warmth spreading through her hands and chest, but even more, she liked knowing she was giving her body something steady and wholesome. She realized she was no longer waiting for a reason to care for herself. She was doing it as a matter of course. Sometimes she thought about how invisible the tea's protection was. There was no dramatic feeling, no sudden rush of energy. It worked quietly, like a friend who never announced their good deeds, but was always there when you needed them. She liked that. She liked knowing that her health didn't depend on grand gestures, but on little daily choices like this. One particularly cold evening, she decided to invite Thomas and Alice over for a simple supper: soup, crusty bread, and of course, chamomile tea to finish. As they sipped, she told them about the article she'd read about the tea's antibacterial qualities. Alice leaned back in her chair, smiling. "You know, Mary, you've turned tea into more than a drink. You've turned it into a philosophy." Thomas nodded. "And it's working. You look healthier than you have in years." Mary felt a quiet glow of gratitude. It wasn't about being perfect or never getting sick. It was about knowing she was giving her body the support it needed in ways that felt natural and sustainable. And as she refilled their cups, she realized this was her favorite part: sharing the ritual, passing along the comfort and care, in the hope that it might take root in someone else's life too. That night, as she settled into her chair with her own cup, she thought about the quiet ways we guard ourselves: locks on doors, warm coats in winter, and now for her, a cup of chamomile tea, a daily act of protection, as simple as it was profound. Mary had never been one for the dramatic detoxes she saw advertised in glossy magazines or on television, the ones promising to flush out toxins in 3 days with nothing but green juice or lemon water. She'd always thought those sounded more exhausting than refreshing. Her body, she believed, needed kindness, not punishment. It was during a chat with Dr. Hart that the word detox came up in a gentler, more sensible way. "You know," Dr. Hart said, "your body is already built to cleanse itself. Your liver, kidneys, skin, and lungs are working for you every day. What you can do is support that process. And your chamomile tea, it plays a role there too." Mary tilted her head. You mean it cleanses me? Dr. Hart smiled. Oh, in its own quiet way. Chamomile has a mild diuretic effect. It encourages your body to release excess fluids and the waste products they carry. It's not going to send you running to the bathroom every 5 minutes, but over time, it helps keep things moving and balanced. Mary found herself oddly pleased by the thought. She liked the idea that her tea wasn't just helping her sleep or calming her mind. It was also quietly helping her body tidy itself from the inside out. That evening, she brewed her cup with a new appreciation. As she sipped, she pictured the tea working its way through her system, nudging her body toward balance, helping it let go of what it didn't need. It wasn't a purge, it was more like a gentle sweep. She began to notice small changes after a few weeks. Her ankles, which sometimes felt a little puffy after long days on her feet, seemed less so. That sluggish, heavy feeling she sometimes carried in the afternoons was lighter. And though she'd never been one to track such things closely, she realized she was visiting the bathroom more regularly, not urgently, but comfortably. One afternoon, Alice dropped by for tea. They sat in the kitchen with the late sun streaming through the lace curtains. You know, Mary said as she poured, this tea is doing more for me than I thought. It's like a quiet little cleanse every day. Alice raised an eyebrow. A cleanse? Without kale smoothies and fasting? Mary laughed. Exactly. No suffering required. She told Alice about what Dr. Hart had said about the tea's gentle diuretic effect. It's subtle, she explained. It doesn't leave you feeling wrung out. It just keeps you feeling light and comfortable. Alice sipped thoughtfully. I could use a bit of that, especially after last weekend's barbecue. Mary thought about how often people chased quick fixes for their health, leaping into extreme regimens that left them drained or discouraged. The beauty of chamomile, she realized, was in its constancy. You didn't have to brace yourself for it or mark it on the calendar. It simply became part of your life, working quietly in the background. One rainy day, while reading in her sunroom, Mary came across a book of herbal remedies. In the section on chamomile, she found a line that resonated deeply. Chamomile helps the body release what it no longer needs, physically and emotionally. She sat with that thought for a moment, feeling how true it was. The tea wasn't just helping her body let go, it was teaching her, in its own way, to release the little burdens she carried in her mind and heart. She began to pair her tea time with a small ritual. After her evening cup, she would sit quietly and think about one thing she wanted to let go of from the day. A small irritation, a worry she couldn't solve tonight, a lingering thought that weighed her down. She would imagine it dissolving like sugar in warm water, leaving her lighter. Thomas noticed the change when he came by for supper one evening. You seem unburdened, he said as they cleared the dishes. Mary smiled. Maybe I am. Maybe my tea is teaching me more than I thought it could. As winter edged closer, she felt grateful for this quiet support. The heavy meals of the season, the long evenings indoors, they could make a person feel sluggish if she wasn't careful. But Mary found herself moving through the season with more ease. She didn't feel weighed down, and her energy, though not boundless, was steady and reliable. One evening, after a particularly rich holiday dinner at Anne's house, she returned home with the usual post-feast heaviness. Without even thinking, she filled the kettle. As she sipped her chamomile, the warmth seemed to travel through her whole body, as if it were helping her find her balance again. She slept deeply that night, waking refreshed instead of groggy. It struck her then that the tea's gift wasn't in doing something dramatic, it was in doing something sustainable. Day after day, cup after cup, it quietly supported her body in staying clean and light, just as nature intended. And in a world full of loud promises and quick fixes, that kind of steady care felt like the truest luxury. She closed her eyes, cradling the cup in her hands, and thought, this is how I want to care for myself. Gently, consistently, without force, without hurry, and in that moment, she knew she would keep this ritual for as long as her hands could lift the kettle. It was a chilly Sunday afternoon when Mary's granddaughter, Emily, came to visit. At 16, Emily was all long hair, quick smiles, and a phone that seemed permanently glued to her hand. She breezed into the cottage with the scent of winter air clinging to her coat and the energy of someone who hadn't yet learned to slow down. Mary had planned for this. She knew teenagers could be tricky to coax into quiet moments, but she also believed there was something universal about the comfort of a warm drink on a cold day. So, while Emily was still unwinding her scarf, Mary put the kettle on. "What are you making, Grandma?" Emily asked, peeking into the kitchen. Chamomile tea, Mary replied. It's my evening ritual, but I think you might like it now too. Emily tilted her head, skeptical. Isn't that the stuff people drink to fall asleep? Mary smiled. It helps with that, yes, but it's more than that. It's a way of telling your body and mind it's time to rest, to breathe. You don't have to be 68 to need that. Emily gave a small shrug, which Mary took as a yes. She brought out her best blue-patterned teacups, the ones she saved for company, and spooned the golden chamomile blossoms into the teapot. As the water boiled, the kitchen filled with the sweet, apple-like scent that had become so familiar to her. When the tea was ready, Mary poured it carefully, the steam curling up between them. Emily cupped her hands around the warm porcelain and took a cautious sip. She said after a moment, a little surprised. It's nice. Softer than I thought it would be. Mary leaned back in her chair. That's the thing about chamomile. It doesn't hit you all at once. It just wraps itself around you, little by little. They sat together for a while, talking about Emily's school projects, her friends, the art competition she was thinking of entering. As the conversation flowed, Mary noticed something remarkable. Emily's phone sat untouched on the table. She was fully here, her attention unscattered. After Emily left that evening, Mary thought about how rare it was to share such a simple, unhurried moment with her granddaughter. Life moved quickly for the younger generations, perhaps even more quickly than it had for her when she was that age. Chamomile tea couldn't stop the pace of the world, but maybe it could give them both a little refuge from it. The following week, Mary received a text from Emily. "Grandma, what brand of chamomile do you use? I want to make it at home." Mary smiled at her phone. She knew then that her ritual had found a new home. It wasn't long before she began sharing it more widely. She made tea for her book club friends after their meetings, watching their chatter soften into contented murmurs as they sipped. She offered it to the young couple who had just moved in down the street, handing them a small packet of dried flowers for your first quiet night in the neighborhood. The responses were always similar, a surprised appreciation followed by some version of, "I didn't know it could taste like this," or "I feel calmer already." Mary realized it wasn't just the tea itself, it was the act of serving it. It said, "I see you. I want you to rest for a moment." She began to think of chamomile as a tradition worth passing down, much like her mother's apple pie recipe or her grandmother's knitting patterns, not because it was fancy or impressive, but because it carried something timeless, care in its simplest form. One snowy evening, her friend Alice came over for dinner. After they'd cleared the dishes, Mary set the kettle on and began preparing the tea. Alice chuckled. "You really do drink this every night, don't you?" Mary nodded. "Every night, without fail. And you know what? I think I'll be drinking it when I'm 90, and maybe Emily will too." Alice sipped her tea and smiled. "You've made it into more than a drink. It's a little piece of you." That night, as Mary settled into her armchair with her own cup, she thought about that. She liked the idea of her family remembering her in this small way, not with grand gestures, but with a shared moment over a humble cup of tea. She imagined Emily, years from now, making chamomile tea for her own children, perhaps without even thinking of where the habit began. It struck her then that while chamomile had begun as a personal comfort, it had grown into something more. It was a bridge between generations, between friends, between the rushing pace of life and the stillness that lay beneath it. And as she took her final sip for the night, Mary thought, yes, this is worth passing on. It was during one of her regular check-ins with Dr. Hart that Mary learned her beloved chamomile tea, as gentle as it was, still came with a few cautions. They were seated in the sunny corner of the clinic office. Mary's test results spread neatly across the desk. Everything looked steady: blood pressure, liver function, digestion. But as they chatted, Dr. Hart leaned forward slightly. "You know, Mary," she began in that kind, careful tone she used when she wanted her patients to truly listen, "chamomile is one of the safest herbal teas out there, but even safe things have their limits." Mary raised her brows. "Limits?" Dr. Hart nodded. "For most people, drinking 1 to 3 cups a day is perfectly fine. But if you have allergies to plants in the daisy family, chamomile can trigger a reaction. And while it's rare, some people can be sensitive to its mild blood-thinning effects, so it's worth mentioning if you're ever prescribed certain medications." Mary took this in thoughtfully. "So, it's like most things. Good in the right amount, but not meant to be overdone." "Exactly," Dr. Hart replied. "And here's another thing. Try not to drink it right before bed if you've had too much liquid already. Otherwise, you'll find yourself waking up at 2 in the morning, not for lack of sleep, but for a trip to the bathroom." She smiled knowingly. Mary laughed. Mary. Ah, yes, the midnight shuffle. I'll keep that in mind. That night, as she brewed her tea, she considered the doctor's words. She'd always believed in balance. Even water, she knew, could be harmful in excess. Chamomile was no different. It was about using it wisely, respecting its quiet strength without pushing it past what her body truly needed. She thought back to a conversation she'd had with Emily a few weeks earlier. Her granddaughter had mentioned making herself chamomile tea every night before bed. Mary had encouraged her, but now she decided to send a follow-up message. "Enjoy your tea, darling, but remember, 2 cups a day is plenty. You don't want to overdo even the good things." Emily replied with a string of laughing emojis and a promise to behave. Over the next few days, Mary began paying closer attention to her own tea habits. She realized she sometimes made it more than she needed, an extra cup in the late afternoon simply because the kettle was already on. She decided to keep her ritual focused, 1 cup in the evening, sometimes a second earlier in the day if she felt the need. This small adjustment felt more deliberate, more mindful. She also noticed how the timing mattered. On nights when she drank it an hour before bed, she slept straight through. On nights when she sipped it right before turning off the lights, she sometimes woke in the small hours to answer nature's call. It wasn't a big inconvenience, but she liked the nights when she could rest undisturbed from dusk until dawn. One afternoon, Thomas came by with a bag of groceries. Spotting the chamomile packet on her counter, he asked, "So, how many cups of that do you go through a day now?" Mary grinned. "Just 1 in the evening, maybe a second if I'm feeling fancy. I've learned not to overindulge." He chuckled. "Moderation, then." "Moderation," she agreed, "is the secret ingredient." A week later, Mary shared her newfound wisdom with her book club friends. Over slices of lemon cake, she told them about Dr. Hart's gentle warnings. "It's not about avoiding chamomile," she explained. "It's about using it with intention. That way you get all the benefits without any little surprises." One friend leaned in. "Like the kind of surprises that have you hopping out of bed at 2 a.m.? Mary laughed. "Exactly those." That night, she reflected on how easy it was to take a good thing for granted. When something feels comforting and harmless, it's tempting to think more is better. But she'd learned over the years that balance wasn't just about avoiding harm, it was about deepening appreciation. By savoring her tea in the right amounts, she was preserving its magic. As she sipped slowly from her favorite blue forget-me-not cup, she realized chamomile had taught her another quiet lesson. Care isn't just about adding good things into your life. It's about knowing when you have enough, and with that, she smiled to herself. Enough, she thought, was exactly what she had. Mary had been drinking chamomile tea for months now, but it wasn't until one quiet evening in early spring that she realized it had stopped being just tea. Somewhere along the way, it had become her daily medicine, not in the sense of a prescription bottle with warnings printed on the label, but in the way it worked gently, steadily, without fanfare, to keep her well. It struck her when she was tidying her kitchen cupboards. She opened the shelf where her old assortment of teas once lived, peppermint, Earl Grey, green tea, and noticed that most of them had gone untouched for months. The chamomile, on the other hand, had a place all its own, its packet always within easy reach, its blossoms fragrant even through the paper. She realized she no longer thought of it as a choice in the evening. It was simply part of her life, as automatic as brushing her teeth. That night, she brewed her cup as usual, but with a new awareness. As the steam rose, she thought about everything this little ritual had given her. Better sleep, calmer moods, gentler digestion, a healthier liver, and even a quiet sense of being protected from the unseen threats of the world. If a pill had done all of that, people would be shouting about it from every street corner. But because it was just a flower in hot water, it worked quietly, almost invisibly. Mary had always been the sort of person who believed in small, consistent acts of care. She knew you didn't rebuild a garden in a day. It took tending, watering, and trust. Chamomile felt like that, a daily tending to her own body and spirit. One afternoon, she found herself explaining it to Thomas as they sat in her garden. "It's not that I think this tea can solve everything," she said, "but it's something I do for myself every day that makes me feel better. That makes it medicine to me." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "I suppose not all medicine has to come from a pharmacy." "Exactly," Mary said, smiling. "Medicine is anything that helps you heal or stay well. And this helps." She thought back to the first night she'd tried chamomile, how restless she'd been, how tired in the mornings. She remembered the early days when the effects were subtle, almost easy to overlook. But she had stayed with it, trusting in the gentle shift. Now, those restless nights were rare, her mornings brighter, her mood more even. One rainy afternoon, Emily called from her small apartment in the city. "Grandma," she said, "I've been drinking chamomile every night like you showed me. I think it's helping with my anxiety before exams." Mary's heart warmed. "I'm glad to hear that, darling. It's not magic. It's just that your body listens when you give it something gentle and consistent." Later that week at her book club, one of her friends asked what she'd been doing to look so well lately. Mary hesitated for only a moment before admitting, "Honestly, chamomile tea. Every single day." They laughed, thinking she was joking. But when she told them about the changes she'd noticed, they leaned in, curious. She realized then that most people overlooked the simple things because they seemed too humble to matter. It was the same lesson she'd learned in her years of teaching. Often, the smallest, most consistent efforts brought the greatest results. In the classroom, it wasn't the grand dramatic lessons that stayed with her students. It was the steady presence, the quiet encouragement day after day. Chamomile, she thought, was like that. As spring deepened, Mary began drying her own chamomile flowers from the small patch she'd planted the previous summer. She tied the stems in little bundles and hung them upside down in the pantry, their scent filling the room. There was a satisfaction in knowing her nightly medicine had come from her own garden, tended by her own hands. One evening, she placed one of her homegrown blossoms into her teacup and felt a deep sense of connection, not just to the plant, but to the cycle of care it represented. She was caring for herself in the most elemental way, by choosing something good, nurturing it, and letting it nurture her in return. She realized then that medicine didn't have to be something prescribed in times of crisis. It could be a daily choice that kept the crisis from ever arriving. For her, chamomile had become exactly that. That night, as she sipped her tea by the open window, the soft evening air drifting in, she thought, "This is what health feels like. Not a fight, not a race, just a quiet, steady peace." Mary hadn't planned to become an advocate for chamomile tea. When she first bought that little packet of dried blossoms months ago, she simply hoped for a few nights of better sleep. But now, as she sat in her cozy kitchen with the kettle warming on the stove, she realized this simple ritual had become a thread woven through every corner of her life. It wasn't just about sleep anymore. It was about the way chamomile had quietly improved her mornings, steadied her moods, eased her digestion, and given her liver a little extra kindness. It was about the way her body felt lighter and more balanced, and the way her mind could find a soft landing even after a stressful day. It was, in its own unassuming way, a form of care she could depend on. One evening, she found herself telling Thomas, "You know, I think I'll drink this tea for the rest of my life." He grinned. "That's a long commitment to a flower." Mary laughed. "It's not just a flower, it's a friend. And I think that's why I'll never stop." She meant it. Over time, chamomile had become a constant companion, one that asked for nothing but gave so much in return. It didn't demand big lifestyle changes or uncomfortable adjustments. It simply fit into her life like it had always belonged there. Mary had seen how easily people could drift away from good habits. New diets faded, gym memberships gathered dust, vitamins sat forgotten in kitchen drawers. But chamomile? She never forgot it. The ritual was too pleasant to skip, too tied to the peaceful close of her day. It had even become something of a signature among her family and friends. When Emily visited, she would often call from the doorway, "Is the kettle on yet, Grandma?" Alice had started keeping chamomile stocked in her own kitchen, claiming she could hear Mary's voice every time she made it. Even Thomas admitted he'd begun drinking it more often, especially on nights when the news left him restless. One afternoon, Emily texted her a picture of a mug of chamomile beside a pile of open textbooks. "For exams," the message read. Mary smiled, touched that this small part of her life had made its way into her granddaughter's world. It made her think about how some habits were worth keeping not just for personal benefit, but because they carried a kind of legacy. She imagined Emily one day making chamomile tea for her own children, perhaps telling them about her grandmother who drank it every night. And maybe, just maybe, the ritual would bring them the same calm it had brought her. But beyond the sentiment, Mary knew there were practical reasons she would never stop. She had felt the difference in her health, how restorative sleep made everything easier, how fewer digestive upsets meant lighter days, how calm evenings led to calmer mornings. She knew, too, that as she aged, the need for gentle, supportive habits would only grow. Chamomile had proven itself. Why would she ever give it up? She had even learned to listen for the little signs her body gave her. On days when she felt tense or sluggish, she would make her tea earlier, letting it mark the start of a slower evening. On days when her digestion felt unsettled, she might brew a second, lighter cup after lunch. It was flexible, adaptable, always ready to meet her where she was. One winter evening, as snow tapped softly against the window panes, Mary sat with her journal and began writing a list. Not a list of health benefits, though she could have filled a page, but a list of reasons she loved her chamomile ritual. At the top, she wrote, "It reminds me to care for myself." Under that came, "It brings me peace. It connects me to others. It helps me sleep. It makes me feel lighter. It tastes like kindness." When she finished, she set her pen down and smiled at the page. The truth was, chamomile had become more than a drink. It was a small daily promise she made to herself, a promise to slow down, to be gentle, to tend to her well-being in the simplest of ways. That night, as she poured the hot water over the delicate blossoms, she thought about how easy it would have been to overlook this humble tea. She could have dismissed it as too ordinary, too soft to matter, but life had taught her that sometimes the quietest things made the biggest difference, if only you let them. She carried her cup to her favorite chair by the window, the steam curling upward into the lamplight. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and steady, covering the world in white. Inside, the warmth of the tea spread through her, carrying with it all the comfort of routine, all the reassurance of a friend who never failed to show up. And as she took her first slow sip, she thought, yes, I will drink this for the rest of my life. Not out of habit alone, but out of gratitude for the sleep it had restored, the calm it had brought, the health it had quietly supported. For Mary, chamomile tea wasn't just a drink anymore, it was a way of living. And that was something she would never give up. Mary's story began with something so simple, a restless night, a gentle nudge from her doctor, and a packet of dried chamomile blossoms on a shop shelf. She didn't know it then, but that little purchase would quietly reshape her life. At first, it was about sleep, 1 cup before bed, a little comfort at the end of the day. But over the months, Mary discovered chamomile was far more than a bedtime drink. It became a source of calm in her mornings, a gentle hand on her mood, a quiet friend to her digestion, a subtle protector for her liver, and even a steady guard for her overall health. She learned to savor it, to trust its gentle rhythm. She shared it with friends, passed it to her granddaughter, and found joy in watching others embrace the ritual. Along the way, she also learned something deeper. Caring for yourself doesn't have to be complicated. Sometimes, the most powerful changes come from the simplest daily acts. For Mary, chamomile became more than tea. It became a daily promise, a promise to rest, to listen, and to nourish herself in ways that lasted. And that promise changed everything. To those watching now, especially those in their later years, Mary's journey is a reminder. It's never too late to create a small ritual that changes how you live. Whether it's a cup of tea, a walk at sunset, or a few minutes of quiet before bed, find your gentle habit. Keep it. Let it work quietly in your life, because health isn't built in grand moments. It's built in the little ones. And sometimes the smallest things, like a humble flower in hot water, can hold the power to bring you back to yourself.